to speak to this topic that is very much interwoven with Journey of the Universe, and that is Ecology and Justice. There's a series of that name at Orbis Books with 20 books in it that John and I have been involved with for a number of years, as well as the liberation theologian Leonardo Boff. And when Leonardo Boff got the idea from Thomas Berry, you can't liberate people without a sense of the earth and of economics. And that's what Thomas Berry was saying many, many years ago. So we'd like to begin with Karl Anthony, who's one of the great forefathers, one might say, of the environmental justice movement. And we're deeply honored by his presence today. Every time I go to California in the Bay Area, Karl Anthony and Paloma Pavel, who are a team, are there in the front row. And they have been some of the most stalwart supporters of Thomas Berry and this vision forever. So I'm going to turn it over to them to begin, and then I'll briefly introduce our other speakers. But a great honor, and please join me in welcoming Karl Anthony and Paloma Pavel.
Thank you very much. It's really a wonderful honor to be here and to be on the program celebrating the 100th anniversary of Thomas Berry's life. And we have been, hello? Yeah, is that better? Yeah, it's wonderful to be part of the celebration of 100 years of Thomas Berry's life. I, myself, have only been really following Thomas Berry for 50 years. So I can't really, I don't know that I have tenure, but I read The Dream of the Earth when it first came out. I actually saw the mimeograph copies of that were circulating in a certain place, and I was really impressed with the new story. And as an African American, I also came to the recognition that we need a new story, and that our new story has to be linked with this new story for everybody. So this was a tremendous revelation to me, and as a result of that, in part, but it was a really major influence in my establishing the Urban Habitat Program at Earth Island Institute, which is one of the earliest environmental justice organizations in the country. So I'm wanting to sort of claim this because I want people to understand that this has been a deep game-changing reality for me. This was a really remarkable thing, and then I was surprised to find out, now I've only been working with Paloma for 15 years, and I was surprised to find out that she had a whole history with that, which she can talk about. But and then I was also really quite interested in the United Church of Christ, because the United Church of Christ published the first document on toxic waste and race, and you maybe talk about that. So that's some historical background. What I want to talk about is the old story and the new story. And it's very important as we think about the old story to realize that we are struggling through a phase that we're currently going through that has some of the attachments to the old story and how we have to change that. You know, Dr. Pavel and I went to New York on a climate train. Is anybody here? Was anybody here on the climate train? We, for the People's March for Climate Justice, and basically there were 400,000 people in New York City, and some got arrested down on Wall Street. Yes. You remember that? Some got arrested. There was 100 people got arrested on Wall Street. There were 3,000 people protesting on Wall Street because of the manipulation by the financial elite in the world. But many people may have forgotten the history of Wall Street, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that and how that really changed people's consciousness. About 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they were going to build a huge general administration building across the, just across the way from Wall Street. And they were digging a hole in the ground to make way for the foundation. And when they dug under the proposed site, they came across a few bones. And they said, well, we want to just go ahead and finish this up. And fortunately, there were some archaeologists here who said, wait a minute, you can't, if they're bones here, we have to figure out what they are and what their significance was. And there was a little tug of war, and eventually they discovered that this was actually a burial ground for African Americans who had been slaves. And they also found that there were 20,000 bodies buried on this site. And the site was right next to Wall Street. And in fact, the slaves had built the wall that gave the street its name. And the slave market was at the intersection of this street, which got named after the wall, and the East River. So this was a really deep thing that happened, and what it really opened up is a window on the world of slavery. And people sort of think, well, gee, the North was really cool, and the South was the ones that were creating the problem, and that we need to really be pissed off at the South, but we don't really need to look at the North. But the truth of the matter is, we're all enmeshed in this. It's not as if there's somebody you can say, okay, well, you don't do this anymore. But we're all actually engaged as we are in the fossil fuel economy. So we have to take responsibility for changing our own habits at the same time that we're dealing with the reality of the issues that have to be faced. Now, when you look at the story of slavery, African slavery in the world, it turns out that between 1500 and 1800, there were 7.5 million slaves captured and brought to the New World to work in bondage. And there were only 1.5 million Europeans. So there's a 5-to-1 ratio between the number of Africans in the New World. We don't hear about that much, and we don't know what the hell they were doing. We know they were working hard, but nobody's really that interested in them. But the fact of the matter is that the conquest of the New World and the expansion during that period was not only a European expansion, it was also an African expansion. And the thing to realize is that at that time, not only were there 7.5 million Africans brought to the New World, but actually 30 million Native Americans died because of not only because of conquest, but also because of the diseases and all the things that were associated with the slave trade. So we were able in the United States, as a result of a long history of struggle, to end slavery in 1861. Now, the other thing that we don't talk about much is that actually it was not just the Africans who were fighting for the abolition of slavery. It was actually a coalition of Africans and other people, including mostly European people and people from England and a few other European countries. So we operate sort of as if we're inventing this whole process and we don't understand why the white people and the black people can't get together. But there's been a long, long, long history of people struggling for justice. And it was just as much as the white people as well as the Africans that happened at that time. Now, one of the reasons why this issue of slavery is really an important topic is that the legacy of slavery, we actually managed to get rid of it as a formal exercise, but there's many things that are in our daily life that actually carry through and we're still struggling to deal with. So one of the things that is very clear that we have, for example, in looking at our neighborhoods and our communities and all these things, that the issues of racism are still with us. But the other thing that's really important to understand is that capitalism itself was also a product of the accumulation that was made possible by being able to exploit the African labor and to produce enormous wealth for many people who lived in Europe. And there are now, and again, I'm going to call attention to the fact, there are now cities in Europe that are actually recognizing the importance of slavery and are producing monuments and museums and things like that to alert people to how that actually changed the European economy, which is one really important thing. So that's the old story. And we're gradually trying to get rid of the implications of the old story. At the end of that long period of struggle, we decided to replace human slavery with a fossil fuel economy. So people said in those days, well, we can't really get rid of this because our economy depends too much on it. So that was an argument that was made 150, 200 years ago. You can't get rid of slavery because the economy depends on it. We know it's a terrible, terrible thing, but we're so dependent on it that we really can't get rid of it. And so today, those same arguments are coming up around the fossil fuel economy, that we can't get rid of it because everything is too intertwined, and even though it is obviously destroying the life support system on the planet, it's a suicidal pattern that has to be changed. So we're really dealing with this inheritance now. And I can talk a lot about this, but I want to say that some of the colleagues that we work with at Breakthrough Communities, and by the way, I'm a co-founder of Breakthrough Communities, and Dr. Pavel is also co-founder of that. We published a book about case studies across the country of communities of color that are actually engaged in helping to reshape our metropolitan regions in order to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels, in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And these coalitions, or faith-based coalitions, that are actually in many cities across the country, and we have documented much of their work in helping to change our metropolitan regions, helping to reduce sprawl and promote patterns of ecological sustainability and social justice. And I believe that Dr. Pavel is going to give us a little bit of background on this issue of, and I think she's going to give one case study of how these faith-based groups have come together and created a coalition that cuts across race, class, geography, and political alignment in order to produce some real benefits that have to do with what will come to us if we can begin to realize that we have in front of us a pattern that has to change. And it has to change within our social movements, and it has to change on the, outside of our social movements as well. So I think with that, maybe I will introduce Dr. Pavel. We've been collaborating for 15 years. She worked with me at the Ford Foundation as for strategic communications, and she was the editor of Breakthrough Communities, the book that we published about our first round. And she will talk a little bit about these interfaith coalitions that have been helping to build us, and give us maybe one or two examples.
Thank you. I just want to say MIT Press published the book. Excellent book.
And produced an endorsement on the back of it. So we
You got to endorse what Karl Anthony does. Holy smokes. And Paloma, so nice to have you with us.
Thank you. History is governed by those overarching movements that relate the shape and meaning of life to the destiny of the universe. Creating such a movement can be called the great work of a people. It has been our extreme privilege and honor to be part of the great work of the social movements of helping our cities become more healthy, just, and sustainable in response to climate change, and to helping with the rise of a regional climate justice movement here in the U.S. and particularly in California and in the Bay Area, our own backyard. And with climate, why climate? Climate, and also my great gratitude to begin with this quote by Thomas on this 100th anniversary. here at Yale Divinity School, and to also celebrate the ways in which this journey of the universe, quadernity of the book and the film and the expression through the website, and also the conversations among diverse constituents and stakeholders in this movement of experts and scientists and also community leaders are converging for this great sort of uprising, these multiple streams that are gaining velocity and force to really move us on this journey at this moment. And why climate is so critical.
Can everyone hear in the back?
To this time. Can you hear it?
Hold it a little.
Great, thank you. So the heat is on, and there are resinous pine cones that only open under fire. They are specifically engraved in their very essence with this ability to respond to heat and then release the seeds at that time, which is very helpful when there are forest fires and there's a replanting that's needed in that area. And we see that we are these seeds right now in this moment, and the heat is on. And I want to thank Sister Miriam for bringing the sacred seeds forward, and to think of all of us here as being part of who is being released in this moment, and how our faith-based traditions are really inspired in a new way. So I'd like to just share a few transformational moments in this movement-building work, which we see as the great work of our time, and how we've been inspired by the universe story in this work. And so I'm going to just take you right in, transport you actually on a journey to the Bay Area. You all know of the Bay Area as one of the great sort of movement centers, not only in the social movement sense, but also in the earth movement sense. We have 3 earthquake lines. We're at 2 tectonic plates that are moving against one another. And we are river people. We are a place of many migratory immigration movements over time, beginning with both our extractive industries of gold mining, of lumbering, the California, the Old West. So this sense of being sort of a people of movement and of responding to the earth movement, of which we are also a part. And this most recent movement around climate has us heating up, particularly around also being the processor. Chevron, the largest employer in California, and that we're doing the oil processing for the western United States out of the Richmond refinery. And that's one of our frontline struggles right now, is with Chevron. Some of you heard a few days ago on NBC where Chevron tried to buy the election. So this is where we are, is we're working with multi-stakeholder, cross-sector movements. We saw 6 years ago, when the most progressive climate change legislation in the country came across, that we had a sort of moment in history that would never come again, which was the moment was that the California voters moved to go from 14 tons of carbon to 2 tons of carbon in 2 generations. How would we do this? Per year, 14 tons to 2 tons per year, our usage of carbon emissions. So the moment I'd like to take you to is the moment where we had a major win this year. And just to take you to sort of the kernel, the nugget of that, to let you know how this work is informing the movement boots on the ground. So we had 6 coalitions, 6 networks of coalitions. We saw that if we ate one another alive, there would not be a community response to this legislation. Sustainable community strategies were required in each one of the regions. There are 19 regions in California. The importance of regional thinking being that we're 108 cities and yet 1 region. And 9 counties. So by requiring the 9 counties to work together for one plan that included sustainable community strategies, the most vulnerable communities required to be at the table, we had a shot at actually influencing how $290 billion of infrastructure transportation investment would go. Which way would our journey go? Towards widened highways, towards continued sprawl, or towards a possible transit system that works for all? As we move towards the final vote on 5 scenarios that were developed by the agencies in the region, we had increasing concern. We would be making recommendations about what our community groups who had formed a coalition would ask for, and we were getting sort of patted on the head and kicked to the curb. We saw that we had to act incisively and differently. So we came together and we told our story across time. We did a charrette across an 18-foot wall. We told the story of the universe and where we are in this moment in time. We looked at where the Earth began, how it formed over time, the fossil fuel age, its rise, its current fall. And then we also saw our movements: transportation, housing, public health, investment without displacement, economic opportunity, and community power. 6 coalitions where we were across time, taking it over several centuries. And then we moved into the moment of where we are to gather our consolidation and our strength. And then we put time forward, what it is going 6, 7 generations forward, the legacy we wanted to leave. And as we had this day of retreat and of imagining and reinvigorating our movements, we faced the toughest struggle of our lives as a coalition. We went into the Metro Center at 5 o'clock, and we were there for 5 hours waiting to see if the scenario that we had created on our own could stand up to the 5 that they had already invested in. At 10 o'clock at night, the supervisor for the Contra Costa County called a vote, and he said, I vote that we actually remove one of the scenarios that we had intended to measure and instead put in the economy, environment, and equity scenario of this group. When he proposed that, there was silence in the room. Everyone held their breath. We didn't know what was going to happen. We had been working on this for months. We consolidated ourselves with our big history and big time reinvigoration. We paused, and a Republican in the room said, I second it. And I propose that we actually unanimously include this scenario. When that happened, we saw that it wasn't only the retreat that we had taken, it was also the relationship building where we began practicing as we listened and heard one another. And then we went and spent 6 months visiting in cross-sector, cross-racial, interfaith teams, meeting with each person who was about to vote. And when we did that, we listened as we were part of a larger whole, where we were no longer separate or polarized, but actually part of a larger movement. And as they voted to include unanimously, it was as though the World Soccer Cup had just been won. We poured into the streets. There was screaming, there was yelling. There were over 250 people who were in the room from 6 coalitions who had worked together for several years. But the biggest miracle was several months later, when all 5 scenarios were tested. And in fact, the equity scenario that linked environment and economy with social justice won. It was the scenario that actually succeeded more than any of the professional ones designed to lead the new course, the new journey forward for the San Francisco Bay Area. And that made national news.
See why we like to work with these people? Fabulous. Such a good story. Whitney Bauman has been with the Forum on Religion and Ecology forever, almost since its founding, and has done such great work for us, but also in this field of emerging religion and ecology. He has several books, including Grounding Religion and a new one from Columbia. But we want to go right to your paper, Whitney. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm incredibly humbled to be up here with this group of scholar activists, so I'm not worthy. I'll start with that. Second of all, I want to know how I get Danny Glover to endorse my book. So my topic today is called Planetary Journeys in Ecojustice, the Geography of Violence. So journey, I'm going to pick up on the metaphor that we've talked about all day and that Matt specifically brought out in his paper earlier today, this idea of journey. Journey's been a part of multiple religious traditions, whether they're pilgrimages, a specific type of journey, the Hajj, walkabouts, dream time, Exodus, and many other stories are central to most religious traditions. Furthermore, the idea that life is a journey along the way permeates many thought traditions. Sometimes the idea of journey can actually cheapen the value of this life, as in this one is one stage along the way to something greater. But in many ways, journey can help us to trouble or blur violent certainties that tend to structure the world in certain ways. Let me explain a bit further what I mean here. Journey is at least in part inimical to singularity and its epistemological cousin, certainty. In other words, journey involves always and already a bit of unknowing and openness towards the not yet. This is an important point here in terms of discussing planetary justice in the context of Journey of the Universe. While we may be discussing here the context of the universe in which we live, such a discussion should never preclude the multiple journeys, and it usually doesn't, that can and do take place within this universe, nor the possibility of something I brought up earlier called the multiverse. Would the ethical implications of the journey of the universe be different, in other words, from different journeys within that larger journey, or if there were multiple universes? I don't know. This is something that philosophers and theologians from many different thought traditions have been thinking about for centuries. Furthermore, this has been a huge reason for the pluralism of the Forum on Religion and Ecology and of the Journey of the Universe engagement with multiple religious traditions and communities. I won't necessarily focus on the multiple possibilities for journey within a universe, nor the possibility of a multiverse here, but rather on the why the multi in each case makes a difference ethically. Such possibilities are not just important for academic ease. Rather, I would argue, along with many others, that it's unknowing and multiple possibilities that are both central to understanding issues of planetary justice. In light of wicked problems, and that is the technical term, such as global climate change and globalization, we need to have a multi-generational, multi-perspectival approach toward thinking about any eco-social problem that we face. In other words, there's not a single solution, but rather every solution that we can think of creates further problems, and it's possible that our solutions do not matter any more than on a local and precisely not universal scale. There is a sense in which attaching our actions to a universal journey, which has echoes of the individual's hero's journey, of course, might allow us to go away from where we are rather than to stay focused on the specifics of how each and every action reverberates through the multiple lives we influence in the here and now. For this reason, the palaver of the universe might be a better way of naming the journey than in which we find ourselves. Palavers, like conversations, can meander, shift abruptly, end, and precisely are not attached to any one end outcome because that outcome is unknown. In other words, it keeps us focused on the unknown, multiple possible outcomes, rather than getting carried away with a single trajectory solution, something you were just talking about, the ability to shift. What might be more important then than defining a common universe in which we live is asking how our multiple journeys affect one another here and now and for generations to come. This is at heart what I think the journey of the universe aims at. After all, if cosmology changes tomorrow and we discover that there will be a big crunch, or even if we agree with the science that the sun will eventually burn out the planet into a cinder, wouldn't it be just as easy to read chaos, destruction, and live as if there is no tomorrow attitude into the journey of the universe as any sort of environmental ethic? Put another way, there is no grounding in reality of an ethic. Here I agree with problems that fall under the rubric of the naturalistic fallacy. On the other hand, there is no sense in its opposite, the supernaturalistic fallacy, in which we think we, human individuals, can impose order on the world willy-nilly. Rather, there is only co-construction and the proliferation of possible paths we might walk down. Here, however, the paths lead to an unknown territories, or at least to no place in particular. Thus, what becomes important is how we act, react, and co-create these multiple paths along the way to the not yet known. Skipping ahead. So, oddly enough, a story about the universe precisely cannot become a universal story. One result of the unknowing at the edges of our own understanding of the world is an opening onto the context of knowledge. In other words, we become located planetary creatures among other creatures in an ever-expanding universe. Possibilities for extraterrestrial creatures abound, but also possibilities for terrestrial, hybrid becomings and experiences abound. We become aware of our contextual locatedness on a planet and of the many other stories that exist on the single planet's history. If, as Karen Barad has suggested, among others, that performative agency is at work all the way down to the quantum level, then the universe may indeed be indeterminate, as Niels Bohr claimed. If this is the case, then perhaps truth ought to be reconsidered as a regime of truth. That is, truth is as ethical, aesthetic, and political as rather than having to do with ontology and metaphysics. Such thinking allows us to ask not what is true for all times and all places, but what truth regimes we ought to live into. How do our current truth regimes affect other bodies and the becoming of our planetary future? I'm not suggesting here that we create, again, willy-nilly, our own realities, which would require omniscience and omnipotence as if we were acontextual, all-powerful agents creating worlds out of nothing. Rather, I am suggesting that we are co-creators among a universe of co-creators, and that we are also co-created by many different entities on a daily basis. It truly does take a village of bacteria, chemicals, atoms, ideas, languages, proteins, genes, and animals of various combinations of earth, air, fire, and water to make me from moment to moment. I have some choice in that, but I'm not the arbiter of my own existence, much less any others. We are born into and live as part of various co-constructions, and we have some wiggle room as to how we want to co-construct the future. Rather than mistake my own humble ideas about what are some good versus bad ways of becoming with reality and progress towards something that should be evident to all peoples, places, and entities in this giant journeying universe, I'd suggest a bit of humble pie and political persuasions towards certain ways of becoming. In other words, rather than abstracting my idea of the true and good as what is true and good, regardless of context, what is true and good becomes much more about orthopraxis than orthodoxy, something that people on this panel are very aware of, and other people engaged in the journey. This shift in focus turns our attention to what I, among others, might call the geography of our meaning-making practices, and how these practices affect various bodies within the planetary community. So this is the sort of last part of what I want to say in the next couple pages. The geography of knowledge versus the evolution of ideas is what this little section is called. So in his book, Slow Violence, Rob Nixon suggests that we begin to look at the geography of daily violence rather than solely the temporality of progress. In other words, focusing on progress at times allows us to get caught up in a narrative where we move from one problem to another, addressing specific incidents along the way. It's easier to stand where we are, look back into history from our perspective, and focus on the evolution of an idea that leads to the ground on which we stand, rather than exploring the geographical distribution of an idea or how that idea takes shape and affects multiple places, bodies, and geographical areas. In other words, a geography of knowledge must look at how various ecosystems, places, and topographies are affected by an idea, whereas the evolution of an idea allows for solipsism. Many of the issues that fall under the rubric of environmental justice are issues that are dispersed over vast geographies and generations, hence Nixon's trope, slow violence. How, for instance, does our daily bread create vast networks of violence across the planet? How does my writing of this paper create networks of violence due to the construction of and waste of the computer on which I type it? What is the ecological footprint of my long-distance romance? More broadly, what would a geopolitical mapping of my own way of living and becoming in the world look like from the perspective of other planetary creatures? Rather than considering that our own knowledge of the world and universe is somehow progressing or evolving, as if we live in the most enlightened time and all past others are or were in the dark and in need of education or development, and one day we will be proven by future knowledge to be backwards, why not consider that we are living under different truth regimes? The truth regimes of 1,000 years ago and 1,000 years from now were not or will not be necessarily any more or less true. Rather, they co-create the world in different ways. As Mary Jane Rubenstein says in her latest book, the shape, number, and character of the cosmos might well depend on the question we ask it. This means that better and worse ideas materialize in the world that create less or more violence toward planetary bodies, respectively. Given various truth regimes, the modern scientific, the capitalist, the environmental, for example, we can begin to judge how meaning-making practices take shape in the world for various planetary bodies. What are the ecological, social, and other ills and benefits, and how are all these ills and benefits distributed geographically? Such an analysis forces us to take responsibility for the truths and meaning-making practices that we live by. In other words, knowledge becomes planetary, embodied, ethical, and political. Thanks.
And to conclude our panel is Jim Antal, a graduate of the school and one of the great forces in the UCC Church, especially for divestment. So we're delighted to have him with us. He was arrested with Gus Speth on the Keystone Pipeline, and they have a deep friendship as a result. Welcome, Jim Antal.
So, whether we are panelists or participants here, all of us are ever so grateful to Mary Evelyn and to John. Where are you, John, out there? And I'd just like to ask us to pause just for a moment and imagine how the insight, the vision, the recognition that we are interdependent, intergenerational beings living in this earth community, and the resolve of the speakers. Imagine if everyone alive today could experience what we're experiencing, not just externally, but also internally. Imagine how an unimpeachable hope would capture our imagination and convict our conscience, and no caretaker of the status quo could stop us. All right, I'll get on to what I have to say here. So, speaking as a denominational leader and a lifelong eco-justice activist, I want to share with you two stories about spiritual practices that I believe all people of faith and all faith communities are called to embrace today: civil disobedience and divestment from fossil fuels. To illustrate the spiritual practice of civil disobedience, let me ask for a show of hands, how many have heard of the Keystone XL Pipeline? Right? Take a look around. Now, the reason you've heard of it is because of thousands of people like Gus Speth, Russ Powell, who was sitting back there before, Bill McKibben, me, hi Russ, Bill McKibben, myself, and maybe a few of you. In 2011, the KXL pipeline was thought to be a done deal until 350.org organized a civil disobedience action that resulted in the arrest of 1,253 people at the White House, and 63 of us, including Russ and Gus and I, that's how we met, spent 3 days and long nights in jail. We did this because there's a pool of tar sands in Western Canada that is the second largest carbon deposit in the world. Canada doesn't have the technology to produce this sludge, but we do. So the KXL pipeline was to carry that sludge from the Dakotas down to Texas, right over Nebraska's Ogallala Aquifer. Our hope was to get the attention of the president and of the nation. If you're thinking David and Goliath, you're right on track. Proponents of the pipeline have unlimited funds to spend on lobbying, falsely promoting the pipeline as a jobs creator, falsely suggesting that extracting and processing this sludge will bring America energy independence, and discrediting people like me. So, on Ash Wednesday 2013, I got arrested again, along with 48 others, by cuffing our arms to the White House fence. And 4 days later, 50,000 people, including I know some of you, marched in front of the White House. And in between 2011 and 2013, opponents of the Keystone Pipeline confronted President Obama and his closest advisors more than 30 times all over the country. Well and good. What difference did it make? Thanks to our arrests and other activity since 2011, the Keystone XL Pipeline has become a household word. Countless headlines have carried the debate. At a minimum, our efforts have successfully delayed the completion of the pipeline by more than 1,000 days, and thus has kept more than 850 million barrels of Canadian tar sands from being processed and released into the atmosphere. Now, what's really helpful is to translate that into dollars. A new report calculates that tar sands producers have lost over $30 billion in revenue from 2010 to 2013, and $17 billion worth of that revenue is due to citizen protest. And then, on July 1st, just this year, TransCanada's permit to build the South Dakota section of the KXL pipeline expired. Thanks to the delay achieved by activists, TransCanada has lost the required state permits in both Nebraska and in South Dakota. Now, the Keystone Pipeline is only one of thousands of pipelines, and we've made it a symbol of what must be stopped, a symbol of the power of the people to stop it. So I invite you to join me in affirming civil disobedience as a normative expression of Christian discipleship in a context of a disordered world. Just as extreme weather is interrupting business as usual all over the planet, it's time for people of faith to set aside our routines and be led by our conscience in new forms of witness. Helping our president move beyond his ambivalence and compelling our leaders in Congress to move beyond their denial will require a massive popular uprising. And of course, let's not forget that most towns have either a pipeline or rail corridors over which coal and oil are carried. So there are ample opportunities for every house of worship today to study, learn, organize, and engage. Can you hear the call of worship being shouted across the railroad track? Can you imagine passing the offering plate to your neighbor by reaching over the pipeline and then passing it to the policeman behind you before he arrests you? Such a surge in local activism would not only convince the president to cancel the Keystone Pipeline, it would prompt him to announce a commitment to end federal subsidies to oil, coal, and gas industries, and use those funds to launch an unprecedented effort to develop renewable energy, not like what Germany has done for years. And finally, such eco-justice activism could give the president the incentive he needs to do what he knows he must: become the chief advocate for laws and policies that will result in keeping 80% of the known fossil fuel reserves in the ground, so our children and grandchildren will have a planet worth inhabiting. Such a series of commitments would then serve to dramatically reset the ongoing negotiations in anticipation of the International Climate Meeting in Paris in December 2015. Now I'll move on to my second story, and that's about divesting from fossil fuels. Some of you know that on July 1st, 2013, the United Church of Christ became the first denomination to vote to divest from fossil fuel companies. My conference board of directors initiated this when they voted to bring the resolution which I had written to our National Synod. In doing so, we became part of the larger movement that now includes close to 1,000 universities, cities, philanthropic foundations, and faith communities whose investments together represent $50 billion. Why divest from fossil fuel companies? Well, because the carbon they own or have the right to tap is 5 times what it will take to alter life as we know it on the earth. If fossil fuel companies simply continue to carry out their mission, they will wreck the planet. And as people of faith, we believe wrecking God's creation is morally wrong, just as it is morally wrong to profit from wrecking God's creation. Hours after the UCC vote, I received congratulations from several Nobel Prize winners, along with the head of a major Protestant denomination, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu emailed me his congratulations and added, "We hope others will follow your splendid example." And they have. Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Quakers, Lutherans, Unitarians, and other faith communities all around the world at the denominational level as well as the congregational level are now engaged in divesting from fossil fuel companies. And on November 1st, the United Church of Christ became the first denomination in the world to offer an investment fund free of fossil fuel stocks. So I know most of you aren't UCC, but if you're from another denomination, they're also going to open up that fund. So if you have any institutional investing that you want to be fossil fuel free, you can just contact our United Church funds. Now, a divestment campaign tells the world that everything must change, more or less immediately. The just released United Nations Intergovernmental Panel synthesis report on climate change makes clear that we are on the verge of, and their word, I think it's the first time any of these reports have included the word irreversible demise. A divestment campaign recognizes that for the time being, political leaders around the world are incapable of taking action on behalf of the common good when it comes to climate change. In America, the most significant campaign contributions to a plurality of congressmen and women come from the fossil fuel sector. This funding directly correlates with the routine and unapologetic denial of science by our congressional leaders. That there is capital for these campaign donations is the result of the failure of our political leaders to exact a price on carbon that would begin to cover the full costs and consequences of the use of fossil fuels. A divestment campaign recognizes that the free market on its own, without regulatory or activist intervention, is incapable of addressing the external costs associated with burning fossil fuels in a way that is sufficiently urgent. And what I mean by external costs is the alteration of the climate that will soon be irreversible. A divestment campaign shines a bright light on the core conviction that on the core conviction of the American economic system that ownership equals responsibility. I'm aware of the time. I'm going to make this a little briefer. And finally, a divestment campaign builds on historic precedents. We've seen how a worldwide divestment campaign can achieve profound results. Witness what happened in South Africa. In order to keep 80% of the carbon reserves in the ground, our generation needs to engage in a new abolitionist movement. Within our lifetime, mining coal, drilling for oil, mountaintop removal, and fracking must all become as unthinkable as it would be to own slaves today. Starting with a massive divestment campaign, our task as people of faith is to help lead an effort that would revoke the social license the fossil fuel companies need to continue to carry out business as usual. As we carry out this spiritual practice, soon ExxonMobil will no longer be regarded as a prudent investment, and we will begin to remember what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. always said, that we actually have the power, in concert with other political and popular forces, to bend the moral arc of justice. Thank you.
Well, good team, brother.
I actually think that is a note on which to conclude, don't you?